Welcome back, everyone. This is chapter 16, which is primarily over the urinary system, so let's get straight into it. So, the primary function of the urinary system is the excretion of metabolic waste, mostly nitrogenous. So, when you increase your protein intake, you have a lot more nitrogen waste that you have to deal with. So, if you're going to eat a lot of protein, you definitely need to increase how much water you're taking in, so that way you don't have to deal with it. Your kidneys don't have to deal with it all at once. So you have urea, ammonia, creatinine, and nitric acid. Most of these are from the breakdown of nitrogenous products and nucleotides. The other function is osmoregulation, meaning you have to maintain the proper balance of water and salt in the blood, so that way your cells don't get hyper or hypotonic and lyse or burst. So you maintain this osmolarity between the two by regulating calcium bicarb and potassium. It also helps to maintain the acid-base balance of the blood by excretion of hydrogen ions and reabsorption of bicarbonate. It secretes hormone, the renin, erythropoietin, and vitamin D. The kidneys themselves are a pair of bean-shaped reddish-brown organs located in the lumbar region of the spine. They are retroperitoneal, which means like if you open somebody up from the front, that's the abdominal cavity. You won't actually see the kidneys there because the peritoneum that surrounds all the rest of your organs does not contain the kidneys. They're actually behind it. So if you want to access the kidneys, you go in from behind under the lumbar vertebrae. Or you can cut through the peritoneum to get to them. But either way. Covered by the renal capsule, which is a tough fibrous connective tissue. It has kind of a little hilum or depression on the side where the arteries enter and the veins and ureters exit. The ureters are small muscular tubes about 25 centimeters long, 5 millimeters in diameter, that conduct urine from the kidneys to the bladder, conveyed by peristalsis, so that it will work even if you're inverted, let's say. Three-layered muscular wall, so inner mucosa, smooth muscle, and outer connective tissue. The urinary bladder's primary function is to store urine until it's expelled from the body. You have 3 openings, 2 for the ureter and 1 for each ureter and 1 for the urethra. It's expandable due to it being a circular fibrous wall with layers of longitudinal muscles. So when it contracts, it's kind of like it kind of has like rugae on the inside of it, like your stomach, and then as it expands, it stretches. A common misconception that people have is that once you relieve yourself, then that means you'll just have to go faster the next time. I call it popping the seal, something like that. It does not work that way. If you do not relieve yourself and just try to hold it, your kidneys are still producing urine at the same rate, and it's stretching the bladder and then eventually the ureters to their limit. And there have actually been cases where people have died from just sitting there holding it for so long that their bladder ruptures. So when you gotta go, go. The urethra is a small tube leading from the urinary bladder to an external opening, which is how you remove urine from the body. Longer in males than females, and in males it also transports seminal fluid. Because the urethra is significantly longer in males, bladder infections are very uncommon in males, but relatively common in females. So here we've got our kidneys with the adrenal glands, or perirenal glands, sitting on top of it. These produce adrenaline and epinephrine and whatnot. You've got your renal veins and arteries going into it, and then this is your ureter going down to the bladder. And again, you would have a layer of peritoneum over all of this, and then the rest of your organs above it. Urination is triggered when the bladder fills to about 250 milliliters, which again is an average. It just, depending on your size, age, that will vary. But stretch receptors then signal the spinal cord and causes the sphincter in the bladder to contract so that urination is possible. Or I'm sorry, nerve impulses causes sphincters to relax and the bladder to contract so the urination is possible. In older children and adults, the brain can control this reflex so you can hold it. For young children, their spinal cord is not fully developed, so they can't really consciously control it, and it takes a while to gain control of this reflex. So this is just a graphic of everything we just said. Okay, lengthwise section of the kidney reveals three regions. You have your renal cortex, renal medulla, and renal pelvis. The cortex is a granulated layer that dips down in between a radial striated inner layer. The medulla contains cone-shaped tissue. The mass is called renal pyramids, and the pelvis is a central cavity continuous with the ureter. So here we have the renal pyramids. Your cortex is on the outside of that, and then it connects into the renal pelvis here. These pyramids are what actually does the filtering, and they contain within them these little nephrons, and with your collecting ducts that go through, and it's filters the blood contents in the glomerulus here, and then all of that pools into the renal pelvis. The cortex here is primarily just for containing and protecting the apparatus. So this is more or less what it looks like this is a preserved specimen, obviously, but more or less what it looks like in the body. I have dissected a specimen like this of a patient who had a very severe infection when she died, and this entire renal pelvis and most of the pyramids was filled with, what would essentially look like melted Gouda. Kind of put me off cheese for a little bit. The smell was similar. So the anatomy of the nephron, you have microscopic view will reveal that the kidney is composed of millions of nephrons. Each one has its own blood supply, including 2 capillaries, which from the renal artery, the afferent, and afferent here it's derived from Latin. The NT is the plural, or is a plural ending, so in this case like they. And then afferro means to carry towards. Efferent would be to carry away, so they carry towards. So afferent, they are carrying towards. So the afferent arterial leads to the glomerulus. Once you get to the glomerulus, then you will leave via the efferent arterial, and then the blood's taken to the peritubular capillary network, which surrounds the rest of the nephron, and then the blood enters the renal vein. Your glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule is a cup-like structure, and the inner layer is composed of podocytes, which form pores for the passage of small molecules. The proximal convoluted tubule is a cuboidal epithelial cells with microvilli, which increases the surface area for absorption. And you have the loop of Henle, which is a U-shaped tube, which is lined with simple squamous. The distal convoluted tubule, which goes back to cuboidal, numerous mitochondria but lacking microvilli, designed for excretion rather than reabsorption. And then your collecting ducts, which are several nephrons connected to a single duct. Or several nephrons will collect into a single collecting duct. So you have 3 steps in the formation of urine. Your glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and then tubular secretion. So glomerular filtration occurs when blood enters the afferent arterial and the glomerulus, and the blood pressure forces water and small molecules into the glomerular capsule, which is the filtrate. Large molecules and formed elements cannot leave the capillaries. The filtrate contains small dissolved molecules similar in concentration to your blood plasma, and then the unfiltered molecules and components leave the glomerulus via the efferent arteriole. So in through the afferent into the glomerulus, out the efferent, and then it goes through the proximal convoluted, get your loop in the nephron, distal convoluted, and then back out to the collecting duct. Just have a general idea of what is filterable and what isn't filterable as far as this table is concerned. Under normal circumstances, you reabsorb 100% of your glucose. The 120 over 80 is how much, I'm sorry, 160 to 180 is how much glucose that can be reabsorbed per day. Anything above that will end up in the urine. Now, in order for that to happen, you have to have a staggeringly high blood glucose, which usually means diabetes or severe, or you can go by this another way and have severely damaged kidneys, in which case glucose can show up in the urine. But usually, positive glucose means diabetes. Nephrons filter about 180 liters of water per day, which, you have about 7 liters of blood in your body. So if your kidneys weren't doing their job, this is how much would be leaking out of you every day. Like, can you imagine having to drink that much and then replace all of the electrolytes and whatnot that is lost? Molecules and ions are reabsorbed both actively and passively, and then the reabsorbed materials travel from the nephron to the blood via the peritubular capillaries. Sodium is reabsorbed by active transport, about 65% of it. Chloride is passively reabsorbed following the sodium. This causes an increased osmolarity of the blood, which allows the water to be reabsorbed by osmosis from the tubule into the blood, so you're not, whizzing 180 liters a day. Nutrients such as glucose and amino acids are also returned to the blood, which is a selective process because only molecules recognized by carrier proteins are actively reabsorbed. Glucose is almost completely reabsorbed due to the plentiful supply of carrier proteins, which makes good sense because your nervous system has to have glucose. The body is all about keeping the brain alive, so even the kidneys do their part for that. Excess glucose ends up being excreted because every substance has a maximum rate of transport. So again, if you are above that, then you're probably diabetic. In diabetics, the excess glucose is present in the blood because the liver and muscles fail to store glucose as glycogen. Kind of, yes. There is an upper limit to how much glycogen you can store. Above and beyond that, you're going to just, the blood will just hold on to the glucose because it hasn't got anywhere else to go. Kidneys can't reabsorb it all. It increases osmolarity in the filtrate, causing water to be reabsorbed into the peritubular network cavity, which leads to frequent urination and thirst, which are two of the telltale signs of diabetes. This filtrate that enters the proximal convoluted tubule is divided into two portions. The reabsorbed filtered components and most of the water nutrients and the required salt, mostly ions. And then the non-reabsorbed, so some of the water, most of the nitrogenous waste, and any excess salt. Tubular secretion, second way to remove substances from the blood and add tubular fluids. So hydrogen, potassium, creatinine, and many drugs are actively transported from the blood. One of the reasons why they take a urine sample for drug screens. Urine ends up containing the filtered substances that have not been reabsorbed and the substances that have been actively secreted. Kidneys maintain the water-salt balance of the blood within normal limits, which automatically affects the blood volume and blood pressure. Most of the water and salt present, and the salt we're talking about here is sodium chloride, table salt, which remind me sometime to go on my rant about sodium chloride. It's somewhat amusing, but don't have time for it here. Present in the filtrate is reabsorbed across the wall of the proximal convoluted tubule. Excretion of hypertonic urine depends on reabsorption of water from the loop of the nephron to the collecting ducts. So reabsorption of water requires that you reabsorb salt, establish a solute gradient dependent on the salt, and then the reabsorption of the water channeled through aquaporins. Kidneys regulate the salt balance in the blood by controlling excretion and reabsorption of various ions, sodium being a key one, but there are others that are regulated, including magnesium, bicarb, and potassium. More than 99% of sodium filtered by the glomerulus is reabsorbed into the blood. 2/3 of it at the proximal convoluted tubule, 25% by the ascending loop of the nephron, and 7% in the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct. Hormones control sodium reabsorption at the distal convoluted tubule. Aldosterone promotes the secretion of potassium ions and the reabsorption of sodium. The kidneys themselves promote aldosterone release when the blood pressure is too low for glomerular reabsorption, which causes renin to be released by the juxtaglomerular apparatus when blood pressure is low, which leads to aldosterone release. And there's a whole pathway with that, but don't worry too much about it. Atrial natriuretic hormone is a hormone secreted by the atria when the cardiac cells are stretched due to an increased blood volume. So, this is the atria of the heart. This hormone also regulates sodium, but in this case, because you have too much blood volume, the heart's being stretched out, you're going to promote secretion of sodium, so you will lose more water, which means you're going to inhibit renin secretion in the juxtaglomerular apparatus and inhibit aldosterone release, which promotes sodium excretion or natriuresis. The long loop of the nephron has two parts. You have your descending and ascending limb. Salt diffuses out of the lower part of the descending limb and then is actively transported out of the upper part of the ascending limb. And the ascending limb is impenetrable to water, or impermeable to water. To establish a solute gradient, you have to have a difference in concentration of solute, which will produce an osmotic gradient, meaning that the water wants to flow from a concentration of high solute to low, and urea also contributes to the solute concentration in the medulla, and the result is a favorable gradient for the reabsorption of water. So as you go through the descending limb here into the loop of the nephron, you're losing a lot of water, but then you pull all the sodium out of the ascending loop here, which creates a concentration gradient to help pull more water out of the collecting duct so that it doesn't end up going into the bladder. This concentrates your urine. Water leaves the descending limb of the loop because of osmotic gradient, the countercurrent mechanism. Salt is actively pumped out of the ascending limb, which regulates the osmolarity. The fluid is hypotonic and urine is hypertonic, meaning that the excess water would then need to be secreted. When urine needs to be hypertonic, then your antidiuretic hormone is produced by the posterior pituitary gland. In the absence of antidiuretic hormone, the collecting duct is impermeable to water and dilute urine is produced. In the presence of your antidiuretic hormone, the collecting duct becomes more permeable to water and urine concentration is increased. Caffeine is a diuretic, meaning that it will make you lose more water through the urine. So diuretics increase the flow of urine. Alcohol, caffeine, and other diuretic drugs. So alcohol inhibits antidiuretic secretion, and it's the dehydration that causes a hangover. So the only way to prevent this is every time you take a shot, you've got to drink water. or follow a beer with a bottle of water, something like that. You have to keep yourself as hydrated as possible in order to prevent dehydration. Caffeine increases your glomerular filtration rate and decreases tubular reabsorption of sodium, and without that sodium, you don't have anything to pull the water out of the urine. And the majority of other diuretic drugs inhibit active transport of sodium at the loop of the nephron or the distal convoluted tubule, and again, without reabsorption of sodium, you're not pulling water out of the urine. For acid-base balance, most body fluids, your pH is around 7.4, give or take half a pH. Anything above 7.4 is alkalosis. Anything less than that is acidosis. We have an acid-base buffer system in the blood already to kind of keep things within that range. So anyone who tells you that you're going to, drink alkali water and change the pH of your blood to help you be healthier or something, no. It does. If you were actually, first of all, that's not how that works. Second, even if it did, you should avoid alkali water like the plague then, because if it changes the pH of your blood, that can be fatal. Anything a full pH higher or lower than this is fatal. So like 6.4 to 8.4. That's the range that you can live within. So your respiratory center, as we talked about in the previous lecture, and the kidneys also help to maintain your pH. So the buffer system, we have a buffer is something that can take up that can take up excess hydrogen or hydroxy ions, and it prevents large swings in pH. Eventually they can get overwhelmed, though, if you just keep adding more. So it helps keep things stable where they are, basically. So the best one for this is bicarb. Well, it's actually bicarb is not it's not individually the best, but it is the most abundant. So you can exchange a lot of hydrogen or hydroxy through bicarb to maintain a stable pH. There are other buffers like hemoglobin that are a lot closer to your 7.4, but there's just so much bicarb around, it does the majority of the work. So if you increase your respiratory rate, you're removing CO2, which removes hydrogen ions, forces the reaction further to the right. The inverse is true about slowing your breathing. And then the respiratory system thereby adjusts the proportion of carbonic acid, or bicarbonate acid, and bicarbonate, which is bicarb, and carbonic acid. The kidneys can remove many acids and bases, but they're slower acting than the respiratory system, but have a more profound effect. They can reabsorb bicarbonate as necessary or excrete hydrogen ions. And then in the urine, ammonia can absorb hydrogen, and phosphate provides another means of buffering the ions in the urine. So you're just kind of exchanging these back and forth as needed to maintain the appropriate pH. Major illnesses disorders of the kidney. So many major illnesses can cause kidney disease. So diabetes, you're overwhelming the kidney's ability to filter out all that glucose. And think of it as like running too much gunk through a filter. Eventually you're going to tear the filter up. Hypertension, the high blood pressure, you're forcing more through the kidneys at any given time than it is designed to handle. So similar thing, eventually you're going to wear it out. And then there are specific autoimmune diseases that can target the kidney itself. Tends to damage the glomeruli, resulting in a decreased glomerular filtration rate and eventually kidney failure. Pyelonephritis is an infection of the kidneys, usually comes up from the urinary bladder. So you get a bladder infection, and then the infection spreads via the ureters to the kidney. Usually you give antibiotics for this, but it can cause severe damage. Kidney stones, hard granules that form in the renal pelvis. An interesting thing about this, for a lot of people that have UTIs, they will drink cranberry juice, and because it actually changes the pH of your urine, because the cranberry juice is rather acidic, so your kidneys have to work to maintain your pH, the pH of your blood. So the urine becomes more acidic because you're trying to get rid of all that acid. And that does actually help with UTIs a bit because it makes the environment less hospitable for the invading pathogens. Here's the catch: all of these kidney stones form better in acidic environments. So if you're constantly chugging stuff like that, you're more likely to get a kidney stone. And it's a hard little granule that forms in the renal pelvis. It's usually composed of like calcium, phosphate, uric acid, sometimes protein. So if you're eating like if you were on a carnivore diet or something, you might be more prone to kidney stones. Imbalance in urinary pH, like if you're drinking cranberry juice constantly, or if you already have a UTI, then it can contribute to it. Uh, Most will pass unnoticed, but large stones can be very painful. I have been assured by my mother, who had 4 children without anesthesia and multiple kidney stones, that she would much rather have a baby than pass a large stone. So I have been assured that kidney stones are indeed incredibly painful. Disorders of the kidneys. So one of the first signs of kidneys damage is the presence of albumin, white blood cells, or red blood cells in the urine. You can actually do a test of microalbumin to see if there's protein seeping through, and it's a good indicator of early onset of diabetes or renal failure. Once more than 2/3 of the nephron have been destroyed by a disease process, then urea and other waste products accumulate in the blood. This is known as uremia, and a retention of water and salt can lead to edema, which is swelling. Your retaining fluid in your whole body and tissues are swelling up, puffing up. This can lead to heart failure because the heart has to move all of that fluid around as best as it's able. If your kidneys are failing, you can undergo hemodialysis, which, every week or two, whatever it works out to be, then you have to have your blood filtered through a selectively permeable membrane that cleanse the blood, adjust the pH, maintain the water and salt balance, and then recirculate it back into you. Something like this. Essentially, this is a artificial external kidney, and you're just running blood through and circulating it back into your system. Options for kidney failure: well, you either have to have continuous ambulatory peritoneal dialysis, meaning you're hooked up to something like this. Ambulatory means you're able to walk around. Used when hemodialysis centers are not available. The peritoneum is you use the peritoneum as the dialysis membrane, which, remember, I told you the kidneys are retroperitoneal. So a fresh amount of dialysate is introduced directly into the abdominal cavity through the implanted tube, and then waste and salts pass from the blood vessel to the abdominal wall from the dialysate, and the fluid is collected several hours later. Not the most pleasant sounding thing, because you literally have a tube stuck in your abdomen where they're pouring this fluid into in order to filter your blood, and you have to come back hours later for all of this to be collected. Preferably, you would just go in, get hooked up like this, and spend some time like reading a book or something. Kidney transplant. You can surgically replace the defective kidney with a healthier donor, but organ rejection is always possible. Best possible matches are frequently from family members, but you have to be careful with that. Transplants from like father to son are not always the best option because, I should say from parent to child, because you're guaranteed that half of their MHC or hormones, their major histone compatibility MHC complexes are going to be incompatible. So a lot of times siblings kind of work better than parents, but yeah, it's kind of a lottery. Usually, you can about 95 to 98% of people survive the first year after kidney transplant, which is kind of the danger period. The problem is there's not a lot of donor organs. Most people like to take them to the grave with them, which, again, I've got a whole rant about that, but no time for it here. So bladder and urinary infections. So infections are the most common cause of problems bladder and urethra infections. So the most common issues are caused by infections. The urine leaving the bladder is usually bacteria-free, and then the distal urethra is normally colonized with bacteria, which, again, if you're a female and your urethra is much shorter, there's a lot less distance that bacteria has to travel to get to the bladder. Sometimes harmful bacteria from the urethra gain access to the bladder. We already said that. So as you can imagine, the female urethra is, not very long, fairly broad. The male urethra has to go a lot further, so it's a little narrower. Bladder stones can form at any age, usually as the result of bladder infections or some form of inflammatory process. Sometimes prostate enlargement in men because you can't fully empty your bladder every time. And the urea and whatnot in the bladder can crystallize. Desert creatures like kangaroo rats, for instance, when they urinate, their urine is so highly concentrated that the moment it hits the ground, it crystallizes, which is kind of cool. You can either remove them surgically or break them apart with lithotripsy, which is basically like they take an ultrasound and it's tuned to the right frequency to make it shatter, and then you just pass them. Bladder cancer, most common type of cancer affecting the urinary system. 4th most common type of cancer in men, 10th most common in women. Greatly increased with smoking, as with most cancers. Can be very malignant, necessitating the removal of the bladder. So here we have the bladder wall. They just kind of marked it on this x-ray here, because x-rays are not great with defining soft tissue. But then here's all of these stones contained within the bladder. There have been tremendous strides lately with growing organs in petri dishes. One of the things you can do for heart transplants, for instance, is because there's a lot of connective tissue in the hearts that's acellular. You can basically bleach the heart, essentially killing all of the cells that are on that connective tissue, and then use it as a scaffolding for grafting your own heart tissue onto it and grow a new heart around that scaffolding, and that way your body won't reject it. Or for some things it's simple, like a bladder, you just grow one. And there's been a limited amount of success with implanting these into people, but clinical trials are still ongoing. So that's everything for Chapter 16. Any questions, comments, concerns, let me know, and I'll see you next time.